everyone. Namaste and greetings of the day. Welcome to Enact's Power Talk. I am Ms. Amrit Nagpal and I am the head of preschool at ECCED at Birla Open Minds, Mumbai. We all as educators know that stories and storytelling are a very powerful tool that we use with our young learners because it sparks imagination, stimulates our curiosity, as well as it helps us develop social skills and communication skills. But have you ever wondered how our brain responds to stories? Interesting, right? So, in this session, let's discover the neuroscientific findings of how stories and brains affect each other and why, as educators, it is important for us to understand this and utilize it optimally into our classrooms. So, let's take a sneak peek at how are the workings of the brain while narrating stories. Interesting. Let's get started. So, when a storyteller or an educator narrates a story, the first thing that happens is there is a series or a flight of imagination that the young mind goes through or the child goes through. And most psychologists refer to this as a narrative transportation. Now, this narrative transportation triggers neural coupling, which means that similar brain patterns happen between the storyteller, that is you as an educator, and the listener, that's the child, right? So when these brain patterns are similar, and this allows us to turn our story into our own experiences. So most psychologists say that, by the time the child is about 4 or 5 years of age, the child understands the theory of mind. That is, that the child begins to understand the relationship and the ability of putting themselves in somebody else's shoes. And the child becomes more aware of their surroundings and awareness. So, now let's look at what happens next. The next step that's happening is mirroring. Now, what happens in mirroring is that the speaker and the listener, while the speaker is narrating the story or the teacher is narrating the story, the listener, that is the child, goes through similar experiences and start putting himself or herself and their experiences into the story. That's where the brain begins to connect to the story and they start applying those experiences that is happening in the story to our own experiences. Now, for instance, if you're narrating a story of Pepper, Bruno, or Peppa Pig, what is happening is that the child of your class, the toddler or the kindergartner, is able to relate to Pepper or Bruno because they go through similar experiences on a daily basis. So Pepper would learn to paint on the walls and try to become an artist, or Pepper would be careless and probably eat too much of cake. So these experiences are the same experiences that our toddlers and kindergartners go through at home, and hence it becomes easier for them to mirror the same thought process. Yes. Now let's look into what is happening inside the brain while we are narrating stories to them. So I'll move on and I will tell you more about what's happening in the brain. So as you're narrating a story, now whether you're narrating a story through dramatization, role playing, or just by reading out a book, the first thing that activates in the brain is the auditory cortex. Can you see here the auditory cortex? The auditory cortex gets activated the first thing. Then, as and when the narration or the story begins, slowly, the temporal lobe that you see here in this goldenish yellowish part, that is our temporal lobe. Now that starts getting active. And you know what is this temporal lobe responsible for? It is responsible for language. Now, there are many stories that use a lot of repetition in terms of language. That is why, as good storytellers, while you're working with the younger students, it is important that our choice of vocabulary words is bang on correct, apt, and appropriate for that age group. Because like I said in the beginning, you remember we, through stories, are responsible for expanding their vocabulary and language skills. So, there are different stories, like in the story of Zelda the zebra, where, she keeps crying, yipes, yipes, I lost my pretty stripes, yipes, yipes, I lost my pretty stripes. And she keeps saying that throughout the story. So that is where the auditory cortex and the temporal lobe start stimulating. And another example that I could give you is the story of the Three Little Pigs is one of my favorite stories, because every time the big bad wolf comes in, the big bad wolf says, I will huff, I will puff, and I will blow your house down. And this is what creates stimulation in the brain. Now, these two parts are already stimulated, that is the auditory cortex and the temporal lobe that is responsible for language. Now, if a storyteller or a teacher is very effectively narrating a story with voice modulations, with different annotations, and she understands the story arc, which I will soon be getting onto. So at that point of time, a well-noted and a well-narrated story is going to engage the students further. So what's going to happen is, the adjoining lobes, that is the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, also start being stimulated and engaged. For instances, when you describe a lot of food in the story, so in the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, when they're talking, when Goldilocks goes to the first porridge and says, it was piping hot, it burnt my tongue. That is description of food. Or it was, very spicy, I started sweating. There was no salt at all, and it was too bland for my taste buds. And when Goldilocks comes to the third bear, the baby bear, and when she takes in the first bite, it is so perfect because it has the appropriate sweetness for my taste. That is where your sensory cortex that you can see in blue starts getting activated. Similarly, the motor cortex can also get activated when we keep describing different motion and different actions. Wherein, the story of the hare and the tortoise. When the hare and the tortoise, when you make different actions, like, like the hare ran fast, the hare ran very, very fast, very, very fast. Or the tortoise ran very slowly, tuchuk, 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 tuchuk. So just by thinking about different food, the smell of the food, the taste of the food, or different actions like running, walking, these keep our brain very active and engaged at the same time. So there's a lot of research that has been done about stories and brains together. And most researchers have found out that when stories are being told and stories that have a special hidden meaning or an embedded meaning behind it, these are the stories that children remember better and for a longer period of time rather than just giving them some facts. So that is something that we as educators must understand, that as educators we need to narrate our stories or dramatize our stories in a well told manner that it captures, engages and activates the child's brain. Well, that's not it. We move on further. As and when you're narrating the stories, every story has a crisis, and the crisis of the story needs to be elongated appropriately, not too much, not too less, because it is over here the different hormones in the brain releases into the bloodstream. So whenever a main character of the story goes through a problem, dopamine in the child's brain is released into the bloodstream. Dopamine is a hormone that talks about a lot of emotions, which for most storytellers, they also refer to this as cliffhanger. So, do you remember the movie Bahubali? And Bahubali 1 ended by saying that Kattappa ne Bahubali ko kyun mara? And that kept the entire audience on the cliff. And we had to wait for 5 years to know the entire story till the sequel came. In the same way, when we narrate stories to our children, it is important that we ensure that dopamine is released, because this dopamine in the body is going to create emotional engagement to the story. The child is going to be completely attentive to know that, oh my God, the main character in the story is in crisis and is going to wait for the climax. You will see at this point of time, most children are completely engrossed and engaged into your storytelling.